I'm I'm struggling with a cough, but seem to have been sort of putting up with it for a few days at this stage. So I'm sure I'll survive. But if not, somebody can just read the slides instead of me. If I collapse. So what I wanted to talk about was originally I was thinking about the external economic forces at work, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed that the internal economic dynamic was more important. So I, in addition to housing, economic history is one of my main areas of interest, and what it does, I think, is it helps with the bigger picture. So this graph shows us how rich countries were around the time Ireland became independent. So over here is richer and over there is poorer. Ireland was sort of in the less wealthy club, and this shows how fast per capita incomes grew over the following 75 years or so. What's kind of interesting about it is that we think of Ireland as being this economic outlier and is always different to everywhere else. But actually, its economic performance is very similar to what you would have predicted if in 1923 you knew what European average incomes are going to be in 2000. You just said where Ireland is, given how poor it is, you'd expect it to grow by something like 2.5% to 3% a year in terms of incomes. That's exactly what it did. Instead, the second graph looks the very not a commonly used metric, but number of people per square kilometre, population density. And here you can see something of a trend that the less densely populated countries over the course of the 20th century caught up in terms of their population size, which is a different metric to their average incomes. But Ireland here is an outlier. It had one of the lowest population growth rates despite being one of the least densely populated countries in Europe. What's interesting about that is not just in the past we were a demographic outlier, but actually, and that's kind of what sums it up there, every other country in Europe between 1850 and the late 20th century was used to seeing a population increase of between 5 and 10% per decade. Ireland was used to seeing population loss of 5% per decade. But as you skip through to the forecast for 2015 to 2080, Ireland's not top of the class in terms of population growth, but it's up there. It's number 3 after Norway and Sweden, both also not very densely populated countries. So that catch-up in terms of demographics is likely to continue throughout the 21st century. And I think the best way of summarising that is to put those last two graphs together and just do the subtraction of the two. Ireland is the only country in Europe that is going to see faster population growth in the 21st century than in the 19th or 20th. We are different. We're different because we're delayed in terms of accommodating a larger population. So if you look at what happened, most other European countries, they went from having reasonably large cities to having very large cities during the 19th or maybe 20th century. Ireland still doesn't have a large city. It's got Dublin, which is whatever, somewhere in the top 500 in the world, but it's not a large city, especially when you think that it was the 5th or 6th largest city in Europe in 1800. It's now sort of way down the list. So we're catching up. At least we should expect to catch up during the 21st century. And when you look at that trend, the change from population decline to population growth, there's two other ways we stick out in terms of demographics. On the left-hand side is urbanization, and the lower bar here is what percentage of the population were living in cities in 1960, and how did that change over the following half century. And you can see that Ireland and Portugal have been consistently the least urban countries in Europe. And that's true in 2016 as it was true in 1960. In fact, Portugal sort of leapfrogged Ireland in that period, and Ireland is now sort of the least urban, and this is the key point, it's the least urban in terms of where we live, not where we work. I'll come back to that. And the other way we stick out is that we've got a higher average household size. So this is information from 2014, but if you look at any point over the last 20, 30 years, Ireland has had the highest average household size, which is the largest number of people per dwelling. And again, you could kind of think of this as, well, we're different because, I don't know, we're Catholic or something. Well, half of Europe is Catholic. That's not really going to do it. We're not that Catholic anymore. And we do have a young population, but it's getting older relatively fast. So all the indications here, if you did this average household size over time, which I show later, you can see it's coming down, but in recent years it's been blocked from going down. That's my interpretation, that average household size has stopped falling, not because we're different, but because there isn't the housing for population size to continue, for household size to continue falling. These are Lorenz curves, so the students in the room should be more than familiar with this, but basically I'll explain it. This line here shows the line of equality. So if you had 100 census districts and each of them had 1% of the population, this is what the line would look like. If you had 100 census districts and only the one of the census districts had all the population, you'd get a black line that goes all the way up here, and at the very last one it would jump up. So it's ranking them by how much of the population is in each census district, and you can see that the bottom 80% in terms of population, the bottom 80% of census districts account for about 35% of the population. What does that mean? Well, flip it around. The top 20% account for 65% of residents. They are our cities. The top 20% of census districts account for about 2/3 of our residents. We just saw that Ireland has about 2/3 of its population in cities. So these 20% here contain 65% of residents, but 85% of jobs. So actually we have this, the gap between these two lines is the mismatch between where we live and where we work. We actually have, relatively speaking, as urbanised a labour market as other European countries now. That may not have been true 50 years ago, where we were significantly more agricultural, but now we are as industrialised, that's probably the wrong word, servicised is a better word, was the first major economy to have more than 50% of its export revenues coming from services. We're a modern economy in terms of our labour market, but our housing market is still lagging way behind. And the net effect of this is that we have some of the longest commute times in the world. In Ireland, we think of London and Los Angeles and say that it must be awful to live in those places. But they have the upside of, large cities have a much broader range of services, amenities that come with a large city. So the sort of the quid pro quo is that yes, you get these really long commute times, but you also get a breadth of retail and consumption amenities and labour market amenities that you just don't get in a city of 1 million, or indeed 10 cities of 1 million gives you less than one city of 10 million. What we have in Ireland, as Colin McCarthy has pointed out a few times, we've people commuting more than the greater Tokyo area, which is home to about 32 million people. Just to come to Dublin. They'll come from Cavan or Wexford or Portlaoise, and in that area you could fit Greater Tokyo, which has 32 million people in it. So we have backed ourselves into a corner where we have a very low quality of life in terms of commuting because we're so spread out. And that is the challenge for Ireland 2040. It's a challenge even beyond that as well, actually, when you look at the population projections off into the middle distance, 2060 or 2080, as the census and the Eurostat will give you. And this brings up the topic of where the economy is going to go. I think if I stopped now, you'd probably come away with the conclusion that it's going to be in the cities, where the debate probably starts happening is, well, which cities are going to get it? And what I worry about, and I on my way here, I just bumped into a PhD student of mine, and her first paper is looking at this. Is Dublin too big? Right? And I don't want to give away the punchline of her paper, but the answer is no. She'll be writing more than just those two letters. The argument you often get is that Dublin is too big because it's about 1/3 of the size of the population, and that just is too big when you look at other countries. Well, let's look at other countries. This is every country in Europe ranked by how big they are in terms of population. This is population in logs, but up here is Russia with 180 million people. Down here are the weaker soccer teams, Andorra, Liechtenstein, San Marino. And what you see is that the bigger the population, the smaller the capital city is as a percentage of the total. That's just an empirical regularity. And more so than that, if you plot Ireland on it, Ireland doesn't stick out in any way. It sticks out a little bit if you just look at the Republic of Ireland, or whatever the Brexiteers call us these days. If you look at the island of Ireland, which is probably a more natural unit for thinking about city growth, because up until about 100 years ago, the whole island was a city network, and cities are persistent, so it's unlikely that you're going to get a reset overnight. 100 years is a short period for cities. And when you do the exercise for the island as a whole, Dublin, as a fraction of the total, comes out bang on the line, just like the economic growth is exactly as you would predict if you saw the rest of Europe. Dublin as a share of the total, if you look at the Republic, or indeed preferably the whole island, Dublin is exactly as big as you would expect it. If you don't like that, if you don't like the fact that you've got one city that makes up about a third of your country in terms of population, there's probably two elements that you don't like about it. The first is the geographical footprint, and that comes back to the commuting point. But then you allow the city to be tall rather than fat, so you have to allow building up. The other element, if you don't like, regardless of whether your city is tall or fat, if you don't like having a city with a third of the total, then you just got to go work your way down this line. Right? You got to get the population of Ireland up to 8 or 10 or 12 or 20 million, and then your city will drift down in terms of importance. Now, I don't think we have the capacity to decide, let alone maybe the will or appetite, that, do you know what, let's target a population of 20 million for Ireland by 2040 or even 2100. Right? Those factors are going to be determined at a level above the Oireachtas. Right? The overall trends in population growth are much sort of above the pay grade even of our highest elected representatives. But where the policy can have a role is at the margin for overall population growth. We see that with net migration swings, but also the share and spread of the population, in particular, once you get past your primary city. So here is where we start thinking, as economists always try and remind people of, trade-offs. If you want your second-tier cities to be bigger, it will almost certainly come at the expense of your third-tier cities, not your first-tier city. And they're that's where the politicians have to juggle those competing needs. As you might expect, this connects back to housing, as you might expect me to say. This connects back to housing. Over the last 2 decades, these are the number of households in the country. We had about 1.1 million households in 1996. Now we have about 1.7 million households. And what you notice is, yes, the sort of, if you call these families, 3 to 5 persons, the number of families in Ireland has gone up by about 50%, but the number of 1 to 2 person households has gone up even more as a fraction, and is now the majority. The majority of households in this country are 1 or 2 persons. We have to stop kidding ourselves that we need to get 20 or 50 or 80,000 houses built a year. That's not what we need. We need everything else but more family houses. And that's a tricky one, because we're ingrained to think. Why? Because the people active in the market at any particular point in time are people starting out in the family life cycle. They're the ones that are the easiest vote winners. If you're going to help anyone, you help them. But actually what you need to do is help others who will then free up the family housing. Be they students. I won't do a show of hands, but I can imagine if we asked the students in the room today what kind of housing they live in, few of them would say purpose-built student accommodation. Many of them would say either at home with their parents or in a house similar to something that their parents own with 3 or 5 or 8 other students. What's annoying from a sort of an ex-post and even ex-ante point of view is that this change was not in any way unexpected. We knew in the 1990s that the vast majority of the population growth was going to be in 1 and 2 person households. So what did we build? We built rural one-offs. Right. So there's urban and all 5 cities and then Greater Dublin area thrown in for good measure, apartments and urban housing. There's rural one-offs, other rural housing and rural apartments. So you can see actually, even though we knew we needed apartments, or we should have known we needed urban apartments, we built more rural houses. And the consequence of that, here's on the left-hand side, is Ireland compared to every other European country. This time, what percentage of housing is in the form of apartments rather than houses? And there's Ireland way at the bottom. I know that the Shetland Islands is somewhere above Ireland, below Malta, not a financial hub, but still able to provide more apartments per head of population than Ireland is. The average is somewhere around a half, between a half and 2/3 of housing in apartments, and we're down at about 15%. If you were to just sort of jumpstart Ireland into the average, you'd be about 500,000 extra apartments. Funnily enough, or not funnily enough, not a coincidence, if you look at our stock of housing and our stock of households, you find roughly the same conclusion. So what do these charts show? This is, for the Greater Dublin area and the rest of the country, how many 1 to 2 person households versus 1 to 2 person dwellings, how many 3 to 5 person households versus 3 to 5 person dwellings. And it doesn't matter whether you're looking at Dublin or the rest of the country, we have a surplus of family houses. We have a shortage of about 500,000 in total of apartments or homes for 1 to 2 person households. How does this connect to the Ireland 2040 plan? Well, these are the numbers. In Ireland 2040 plans, the plan is to build 550,000 new homes. And I think Stephen mentioned earlier about 25,000 homes per year. 25,000 homes per year will not allow the average household size to fall at all. In fact, the average household size will rise slightly if we only build 550,000 homes over the next 22 years. This is the journey Ireland has been taking. It stopped in the crash because we stopped building homes. And if we only build what is an ambitious plan, we will be stuck at that level, whereas the rest of Europe is down here and going lower. So, how many extra dwellings do we actually need? That's on the right-hand side. There's Ireland 2040. Let's keep it at 2.75 people per household. We'd need about 550,000 new homes. If you were to think of Ireland facilitating the demographic change that's already there, but we're suppressing, going down to 2.45 or 2.35 or 2.25 in the average household, you'd be talking about twice as many homes, building just over 1 million homes in the same period of time. So my worry is not that Ireland 2040 is some sort of pie-in-the-sky plan with these numbers that are crazy, and let's just get back to the real world. My concern is that the numbers aren't nearly ambitious enough, given the scale of the housing challenge that's on the way. You think what's happened in the last 5 years is bad. This is going to continue for the next 25 years if we don't get it right. So, what do I think of in terms of, this is the one, apart from the next slide, which is my last slide, this is the text one. I think it's important to recognise, and I had a quick chat with Robert on his way out, it is encouraging that Ireland 2040 is probably the first real official policy document to say cities are important, first in Ireland, to say cities matter and cities are where the growth is going to be concentrated. However, I worry at the futility of saying, let's get some of Dublin and just spread it out elsewhere. That's not only is that not possible, other than through keeping the jobs in Dublin and sending people off to Portlaoise or Virginia or Gorey to travel in every day, it's also not desirable. Going back to the point about London or LA, bigger cities offer more opportunities. So a city that's 5 times as big offers more than 5 times the opportunities of 5 sort of smaller cities added up. So we're losing out as a country if we stifle Dublin's growth. In addition to, what we're actually going to do is just get people to drive longer, which is definitely not sustainable from an environmental point of view. So if we skip forward a little bit further and look at the census, the CSO projections of population, by the 2060s, allowing for urbanisation to keep continuing upwards, Ireland's 5 biggest cities are likely to have a population of 5 million. That's the scale of growing up Cork and Waterford and Limerick and Galway that we need to do. And as I mentioned, I don't think it's going to be coming from the first tier. It's redistribution from what is currently the third tier. The places that get mentioned in these documents as being hubs or gateways or spokes or whatever, they're politically necessary. But let's not fool ourselves that there's no economic damage. And again, it's about urbanisation of residents and also reflecting demographics. And with household size declining, the best way to think about this, well, there's 2 ways that I think are sufficiently alarming for me that I remember them. The first is that Dublin needs 20 extra homes on every single acre inside the M50. That's has to happen at some point, or that should happen at some point for healthy growth over the next 3 to 4 decades. Well, there's 20 extra homes per acre, for every acre. Or if you don't like dealing in acres, let's deal in weeks. An apartment block every week till the 2060s or 2070s. What we need to do, if you're a housing minister, what I would be doing is I'd be going off to the cities that do manage to provide an extra apartment block every week and asking the operators there, what do you do, and can we convince you to come to Dublin? Building apartments is not the same as building houses. We have a construction sector that's very good at building houses but not very good at building apartments. It's more like the office space or hotel space when you're building in apartments, because it's nobody's in till everyone's in. You can't build 20 apartments and sell them, use the money to build the other 80. That's not how it works. Thinking about, and here's where I disagree with Stephen a little bit, the reason nothing's been developed on the Mace Road is because we don't have any internalisation of the economic cost of wasting that site, a valuable site. So with a land value tax, that changes overnight. And it doesn't change in a way that requires the local authorities to become experts at this. They do have to be good at zoning what goes where, so they need flexibility. But it actually privatises the social costs. So it actually puts it on the private sector and says, we need housing, and we're going to charge a fortune until there's housing put on this. And the owner of that site, if they're not interested in providing the housing, will get off pretty quickly. And that allows site assembly as well. So the 3 solutions I think we need, there was a question raised about social housing. Again, this is not complicated. We're doing it all wrong. Let's just do the right things. So cost rental with an income-varying housing subsidy is the obvious way to get social housing of scale. If we need 50,000 homes a year, probably 15 to 20,000 of those will be social, and almost all of those 50,000 will be urban apartments, urban multifamily housing. But first things first, it's very expensive to build. Doesn't matter what you're building in Ireland. If it's residential, it's very expensive. So we need to audit why that is the case. The Department of Housing put out something last year, but very weak in terms of the evidence base, and it flew in the face of everything else that had been published on construction costs, and yet they had no sort of tying up why is their finding that costs were fine at odds with everything else that had been published. So thanks for your time. Looking forward to the rest of the discussion. As I said, Ireland's not an economic outlier, it's a demographic one. We're under-urbanised. That should change over the course of the next few decades. But at the moment, I'm not convinced that it will.